Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to the channel. So I thought today we could talk about the book of Exodus. So there was a time when I was like super into the book of Genesis, and it still is a book that I love. It was anytime somebody brought up Genesis, I was like, nah, that's my book. But now that I've studied the book of Exodus, now I'm kind of like, nah, that's my book. But I obviously love both. I thought we could talk about the book more in depth, just what I took from it, what I learned from it, and possibly give my perspective of things that a lot of people don't necessarily bring up or talk about very much. When you study a book for yourself in depth, you are revealed to so much more than you had thought you already knew. And so I thought we could just break that down. So I'm breaking this down into 3 areas: God and his character, Moses, and the Israelites. Okay, so let's start with God. In the book of Exodus, there is actually a verse where for the first time, I think God actually explains his character to someone else. Throughout most of the Bible, you're kind of just reading about his character, but in this particular verse, he actually talks about his own character. He tells Moses who he is. In Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 to 7. And I remember when I first read this, I was like, wait, God never talked about himself like that. But like, there's something almost weird reading it, but also fascinating reading it. I say weird because often, at least for humans, when we talk about ourselves highly or we just go in depth about our own character, it may come across as self-centered because it's like, why are you talking about yourself? But in the same breath, it's very interesting, I say, because everything God says is true and he only knows truth. So if he can speak of his own character, it's true. The Lord passed in front of Moses, calling out, Yahweh, the Lord, the God of compassion and mercy. I am slow to anger and filled with unfailing love and faithfulness. I lavish unfailing love to 1,000 generations. I forgive iniquity, rebellion, and sin. But I do not excuse the guilty. I lay the sins of the parents upon their children and grandchildren. The entire family is affected, even children in the 3rd and 4th generations. And I think that's the first time, at least in the beginning of the Bible, like first time in scripture, that God describes his own character to someone. And I think it's interesting that one thing God says about himself is that he is filled with unfailing love and faithfulness. Because when I was reading the book of Exodus, long before I even got to that verse, I could see the character of God displayed: grace, mercy, faithfulness. God was somebody who never forgot his promise or his covenant, and it was something that was brought up a lot, which I think is also very prevalent in Genesis as well. From Genesis even into Exodus, God is constantly saying, I did not forget my promise. I will keep my covenant with your ancestors. I will keep my covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob. And so at first I made a list of all the times that he has said that, but it's just way too long. And I started giving up. So it was very comforting to read as well, because it made me realize that God treats his children well. So if God promises you something, there is quite literally nothing you can do. There is nothing anyone can do that will get in the way of that. It will come to pass. And I literally had written in my notes, God's promise and covenant is the most indestructible thing. And I'm going to say why. So if I pull up Exodus 1 verse 12, basically in context, the people of Egypt were enslaving the people of Israel. And the whole motive behind that was that Pharaoh wanted to kind of wean out the the community of the Israelites. He wanted to tire them out till they died, essentially, because he was just trying to break down that generation, right? But then in verse 12, it says, but the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more the Israelites multiplied and spread, and the more alarmed the Egyptians became. Because God's promise was that he would multiply Abraham's descendants. So yeah, you can keep trying, but they will continue to multiply because God's promise is literally indestructible. And I remember I read that, I said, wait. There is no weapon that can break the promise and covenant of God. If you are not encouraged by that, I don't know what to tell you at that point. God's faithfulness and promise really showed itself in this book. If this dog doesn't stop barking, the book of Exodus is where the glory of God is starting to be emphasized, because I didn't realize it was something I didn't understand, but I love the way it's depicted as this like hovering cloud of like thunder and lightning and like smoke. Like, it's just like the way God can like manifest himself in like different forms, I find so fascinating. Like, he came as a human, you know what I mean? He can appear as a human, he can appear as a burning bush. It's so fascinating the way God can present himself. And so whenever the glory of God is mentioned as like this hovering cloud, it's very fascinating, and it made me realize just how holy God is. And I've talked about this, I think, in another video, where to be holy is to literally be transcendent, to be set apart, incredibly different from man, from mortal beings. Being holy is so much higher and just so set apart, so different. And so every time I would read about the glory of God, all I could think was holiness. One of my favorite verses, it's not even one verse, but there's a section or multiple sections in Exodus where the people of Israel are crying out to God because they're literally in slavery. And I love how it says that God knew and heard. I love that when God speaks to Moses, he says that he has heard the affliction of his people. I also love the fact that he says his people, but I love the fact that it's a constant reminder that when you are praying or crying out to God, he hears it. Soon enough, God talks to Moses and tells him that he wants him to free the Israelites and take them out of Egypt. And it's like, he heard you. He heard you, sis. It's hard, but he heard you. And I find rest and comfort in that. Also, another thing, this is going to kind of touch on Moses's character as well. And by character, I'm not calling him a character. I'm saying his actual character. So this is kind of going to go both ways. But I have learned from reading the book of Exodus that God is not waiting for you to be qualified. He decides that you are qualified. There's this expression, I don't even know who said it first, but that God does not call the qualified, he qualifies the called. The beautiful thing is that God picks you and you build your qualifications through whatever trial, through whatever journey you're taken on. And so now we can move on to Moses' character, where I will pick up where I left off on this. So Moses, this interesting man. I think a lot of people have different views of Moses, and I think we've talked about him in different ways. Growing up, I did not really understand Moses, his character, his personality, or anything. And to be fair, that's kind of the case with the Bible. There's a lot of people you don't really get their personality, but I feel like I started to understand it more. As a kid, I just read about Moses as some guy who was like big and buff and brave and decided he was gonna go and like free slaves. That's not how Moses is by any means. But I don't want to speak lowly nor highly of Moses, but I really want to break down what I've taken from his character. I have actually found so many similarities between Moses and myself through reading Exodus, to the point where I'm like, I get it. Are you annoying, God? Yes, but I get it. Moses, this guy has already been through enough. A slight identity crisis, if you will. He's a Hebrew who was technically adopted by Egyptians. So, and I'm pretty sure he was born in the land of Egypt as well. So it's like his nationality is that he's Egyptian, but his ethnicity, I guess, is really Hebrew. He's actually Hebrew, which I was just like, it kind of reminds me of myself, how my parents are Haitian. They are from the country of Haiti, but I was born in America, so my nationality is American, but I identify more with being Haitian, and I almost feel it's the same way with Moses, but that's not even the point. I just thought I'd throw that in there because I was like, oh, I feel you. I get that. I do, especially because the cultures are incredibly different too. The Egyptians' cultures and what they believe in is incredibly different from what the Hebrews believe in. Same thing. The things that Haitian people eat, drink, listen to is incredibly different from America. Even how they raise their kids is different. So I was like, Moses, I feel you, bro. I get that. But besides identity, Moses' personality, his way of thinking, just felt like I was looking at my own reflection. And that's not entirely good. And I'm going to get into why. So when God calls Moses to free the Israelites, it's not like this, all right, so we're going to start this boot camp, or, hey, I've been seeing what you've been doing behind the scenes, so I think you're the best fit. No. God literally just starts saying, ayo, so I've been seeing what they've been going through, and it breaks my heart. I hate to see it. And, you know, Moses is just kind of like, yeah, yep, I agree. Because real talk, if I were Moses, I would have been like, that's really sad. I'm not acting like it's not, but why are you telling me this? And then God follows up with, so I want you to go and save them. And rightfully so. Moses is kind of like, what? Why me exactly? And I don't think it's that Moses was even trying to be insensitive, but it's like, I don't even live there. You know what I mean? Like, of all people, why me? So as this conversation continues, it's God constantly going, yeah, I want you to do this. And Moses going, nah, I can't. Excuse number one. God's like, that's fine. I'll take care of it. I want you to go and do it. Moses is all, nah, excuse number two. God's like, nah, I got that part too. I still want you to do it. Moses is like, excuse number 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And God's like, yeah, but I still want you to do it. I loved this entire back and forth. I actually found very funny because Moses is constantly like, here's a reason why I can't do it. And God's like, cool, here's a solution. Now go and do it. And Moses is like, well, here's another reason why I really can't do it. And God's like, great, here's a solution. Now go and do it. It's like no matter what Moses comes up with, no matter what he says, God's not moving. He's like, cool, now go and do it. I read that and I understood it because that's what God keeps doing to me. And is it annoying? Of course it is. But it's because he knows that you're called to do greater. You cannot be a child of God and be mediocre. He didn't call you to that. So if you are super comfortable in your mediocrity, something's wrong. And if you feel a constant tug, it's God, because you're not called to mediocre. Finally, there's a part where Moses actually gets God angry. Moses then pleads and goes, Lord, please send anyone else. And the fear that I can already hear in just how he said that and why he said it. It's why I can empathize so much and understand Moses, at least in the book of Exodus. There is clearly a fear and lack of confidence, lack of self-confidence in what he's capable of doing. He doesn't just feel underqualified. He's fearful to do the job. He possibly feels that he's at risk because he did flee the land. There's a point where you reach with yourself where it's not even like oh, I feel bad for myself. You have decided that I cannot do this. And I think Moses had reached that point. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. There are verses later on where God says that he is slow to anger. But we watch this go back and forth and back and forth. Of course, at some point, God is going to get angry because he has debunked every excuse you could possibly give him, and you're still refusing to do the job that he's called you to do. God decides that Moses is still going to do what he told him to do, but he will send Aaron, who is a better speaker, to go with Moses because Moses was also insecure about his speech, his inability to communicate very well, to speak very well to people. So God has Aaron come along and help Moses. And there's just a few things here where I definitely saw myself. One, it's the fact that with every excuse that Moses gave God, God had a solution for it. God kept saying, nah, don't worry about that because I have this set up for you. God would actually tell Moses the steps in advance, which is very fascinating because God doesn't do that. God does not tell you multiple steps in advance. He usually gives you an instruction and you move accordingly, and then he gives you the next instruction. But to ease Moses' anxiety, God actually told him multiple steps ahead. This is what's going to happen when this happens, and this is what's going to happen when this happens. So that is why I know that you will do the job I called you to do. When God gives me instruction, I have a habit of just sitting and waiting until I hear go, even though he already told me to, or I have a fear of just sitting until I'm given the next step. And it's this constant God's waiting for me, I'm waiting for him, back and forth type of thing, because he won't give me the next instruction until I get up and move. While I can see myself in Moses, this isn't a positive thing. You should not be so fearful that you do not move. You should not view yourself so lowly and consider yourself so unqualified to do the work that God has called you to do. He called you to do it because he sees you as qualified for the job. And there are times where God will call you to do something that you're not qualified to do on your own. But that's why he's doing it with you. Because with him, you are qualified to do whatever he calls you to do. As the book of Exodus continues from this instruction moving forward, I can see the courage that Moses has. I choose the word courage specifically because it's acting even while you're afraid. Now, there's no evidence to say that he was still afraid, but based off human nature, I want to say he was probably still afraid. Having to go up to a literal king and say like, hey, yo, take them out of slavery right now. There is no way you do that without fear. But I'm inspired by the fact that through Moses' courage, he still did what God instructed him to do. And I hope to also do the same. Now, I'm only talking about the book of Exodus. I know this continues on into Leviticus, etc. But, wow, I'm talking really fast. But I'm focusing on the book of Exodus only. So I know that there's more that happens, but we're not talking about that today, okay? I'm currently studying Leviticus, but we're not talking about that today. Okay, let's move on to the third section, which is the people of Israel. I know this is more so Genesis, but obviously it plays a factor in the book of Exodus, so I really need to mention it. The tribes of Israel. Growing up, I had always heard the people of Israel, Israelites, blah, 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 Hebrews, Levites. You know, I always heard these names, and I had no idea what any of it meant. I genuinely thought the Levites came from a land called, I don't know, Levi probably. I genuinely thought Israel was a place. It is now, but like I genuinely thought it was a place. And it wasn't until I studied the book of Genesis that I was like, oh my goodness, Jacob turns to Israel. God changes his name into Israel. And then he has 12 sons, and so each of them represents a tribe of Israel. Look, I understand you're probably listening to this like, no duh. But listen, I did not know that as a kid. I didn't learn this until I started studying the book of Genesis like last year. I know, it's really sad. But I'm a New Testament gal, so I didn't have much knowledge of Old Testament, which is why I'm purposely reading it now. But it just blew my mind, because that's just like I want to name my child Jacob, because that's amazing. I mean, don't get me wrong, Jacob did some twisted things. Back on track. Let's talk about the people of Israel, right? These people both made me feel bad for them. I definitely had moments of empathy, but they also infuriated me. But because they infuriated me, they also humbled me. I had a lot of compassion for the Israelites when they were enslaved by the Egyptians, because I find it insane how these people once had favor with the last Pharaoh simply because of connection, simply because of Joseph's status. And the fact that years later, there's a new Pharaoh who absolutely despises them and wants to get rid of them. Is that not a genocide? But anyway, apart from that, the fact that they go into slavery for years and years and years and years is absolutely heartbreaking. And the way that they would cry out to God, it literally made me want to cry, like reading it. Because slavery obviously is a real thing that's still happening in different parts of the world. And obviously we're talking about the slavery of African Americans as well. It hits a little too close to home. It really does. And so reading it, I'm literally trying not to cry. Reading that just really hurt. It made it very hard for me to understand humanity and the hearts of a lot of human beings. And I know that the Bible says that Pharaoh's heart had always been hard. It's just, I tried to give people the benefit of the doubt. And so to think that there are people who just naturally have hardened hearts, it's very heartbreaking. And so I really love the fact that God says that he hears their cries and does something about it. Now let's fast forward and get into where they kind of get on my nerves, right? So after Moses finally is able to get the Israelites out of the land of Egypt, I'm wording it like that because Moses did not free them, God freed them. Moses followed the instruction of God that freed them. But when they end up in the wilderness, the fact that the first thing these people do is complain. And my thing is, okay, I get it. You're hungry, right? But to go as far as to say you should have left us in Egypt. So because you can't have bread right now, you would rather go back to slavery. Before I touch on the positive of this, I want to read a very specific verse. It's one of my favorite verses out of the entire book of Exodus. Exodus chapter 13, verse 17. And I'll read this in ESV because that's typically how I study my Bible. We'll do 17 to 18. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. But God led the people around by the way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. And the people of Israel went up out of the land of Egypt equipped for battle. Let me talk about this, okay? This verse literally changed my life. And I don't even say that lightly. It quite literally changed my life, my way of thinking, everything. And here's why. There was an easier route that God could have taken the Israelites. But the reason why he didn't do it is because he knew that it would cause them to look back. And it'd make it too easy for them to turn back. When we get scared, we tend to rely on familiarity. Even if we weren't comfortable, we tend to run back to what was familiar to us. And so even though being enslaved is not something they find comfortable, the fact that they were so quick to say they'd rather be there is because it was familiar to them. They're now in a new territory where they're uncomfortable, but in a different way. Sometimes we prefer to be uncomfortable in a way that's familiar than be uncomfortable in a way that is unfamiliar. Are you following me? And so God intentionally had them go a more complicated route. That way they are forced to continue to go forward. They cannot go backwards because they don't understand how to go backwards. And also from forcing them to continue going forward, it would help them overcome fears and prepare them for battle. Because the final verse says, and the people of Israel went up out of the land of Egypt equipped for battle. So sometimes God is sending you on a route that is very confusing and maybe a little shaky, but he has to do it that way, because if he takes you the easy way that you're envisioning in your head, the moment the going gets tough, you're going to turn back, and he can't have that. Elevation is not you going backwards, it's you continuing to propel forward. And so the only way to do that is to send you on a route that you cannot confidently say you got yourself through on your own. It must be a route that's complicated, because then you're forced to keep going forward. And through continuing to push forward, despite the challenges that come along the way, you are more equipped for the things you possibly wouldn't have been equipped for had you gone the easy route. That was a word. That was the Holy Spirit. Hold on. That's why this verse, I keep saying, changed my life. It really put into perspective why I face challenges, why God offers a promise to me, but it seems difficult to get there. Because he has to grow you in the process. God is the God who can multitask, all right? He's not just going to elevate you, he's going to grow you in the process as well. You can ask God for a better paying job, and he might also grow your character in the process of getting that job. Because why? He's a multitasker. Stop, because the Holy Spirit's on a roll inside of me. And so despite their complaining, God knew them already. And again, I find comfort in the fact that God knows us. There's this verse, I'm not even gonna bother to pull it up, but there's a verse in Exodus, and it's when God appears to Moses through the burning bush. And I'm gonna paraphrase, but basically, God presented himself in that way because it was the only way to get Moses' attention. And it reminded me that God truly knows our humanity. He knows that we are people who rely on wonders and signs, you know, and tricks and things like that. That's how he gets our attention. And so he works accordingly. And so I just use that example to say it's the same thing with the Israelites. God knows them. He knows they're going to try to run back to what's familiar, what's easy, what's less terrifying. And he can't allow that because it doesn't allow them to elevate themselves. He knows us. He knows what he's doing, all right? He will pull out all the bells and whistles to get our attention if he has to. Now, we're not even done with the frustration for the Israelites. Listen, it's the way God was like, hey, I want to make you an example of, you know, my people. Y'all are going to be like the people on the poster, okay? The other people look to and know, these are my people. I am God. These are my people. Let's enter into a covenant, all right? Everybody's all excited, like, yeah, I want to do that. What this taught me was, we are always quick to be on board with promotion. We are always quick to be on board with praise. Anytime when we are set apart and glorified, we're like, oh yeah, I want to do that. They were quick and they were excited because it's like, oh, like, we are people, like, we're going to set the standard. Shoot, yeah, okay. Of course they're excited. But what's the first thing they do? They break the literal first commandment. Bro, there were 10. How you already break number 1? But now let's get into why I say they humble me. Because through my constant frustration with the Israelites, it was also a slap in the face because it made me realize you do the exact same thing. You're getting mad because these people are acting ghetto and you act the exact same way. God gives you a command and you're all, yeah, I'm going to do this for you, God. I love you, blah, blah, blah. And you go and disobey him like 3 seconds later. And so I think it's humbling reading about the Israelites. If you're self-aware, you'll realize you're not too far off from them. Yeah, some people are like, yo, like you really worshipped a golden calf. That's ridiculous. But some of us are worshiping Instagram. Some of us are worshiping the YouTube algorithm. Some of us are worshiping our significant other. Anytime your full focus and attention and devotion goes to something other than God, it is idolatry. So before you start yelling at the Israelites because they were worshiping a golden calf, think about what things you're possibly idolizing. They were idolizing it because they were giving it their devotion, their full attention, quite literally worshiping it, giving it all of their hours and time and affection. But we do the same thing with social media. We do the same thing with food. We do the same thing with the people that we are with. We do the same thing with money. So we're not that far off and we're not that different. It just has a different look. It's still idolatry. And even the complaining thing, we pray and ask God for certain promotions, but when the going gets tough, we start complaining and saying, nah, I wish I was back there. But you can't expect God to bless you without stretching you first. Because if God were to give you something that you are praying for before you are ready for it, it would literally destroy you. People are praying out here to be billionaires, but have horrible financial skills. Imagine God just gave you $1 billion the next day. You would blow through that money. Why? Because you don't have the proper skills to be able to handle that much money. So it's not that God's not going to give you the desires of your heart. He will, but it's possible that you need to be stretched and grown before you can even touch that. I don't know where I was going with that. I'm just trying to kind of juxtapose us with the Israelites so you realize these people are not as crazy as you think because you're just like them. If they're crazy, then so are you. If they're annoying, then so are you. So reading the book of Exodus is literally just an exposure to characters, an exposure to God's character, an exposure to Moses' character, and possibly your own if you relate with him, and it's an exposure to the Israelites' character and how you relate to their character. Am I done? I feel like I talked for a while. This was great. I had a great time talking about the book of Exodus and just everything that I've learned from it. And so if you haven't read it, I highly recommend reading it, but I also recommend reading Genesis first. I just recommend reading the Bible in chronological order. There are tons of websites that break down how to properly read in chronological order because the way it's ordered in the Bible is not chronologically. You do have to do a bit of jumping around. So it's helpful that you find an article or something online that does it for you so you can just follow. They always say to understand something in context, start at the beginning. So start at the beginning. But that's it for this video, so goodbye.